Have you ever realized one day that you're not just somebody's child, but also their caregiver? That experience can be a bit daunting, a bit scary, a bit confusing. Hi, I'm Billy Miranda. I'm a licensed therapist, current PhD student, and this is the Carer's Corner. Welcome. Today we're talking about what it really means to parent, the role shift, what that means for you, and where we're at in our lives and how it impacts us as caregivers, and also the person that you're caring for. What can you expect? Currently, I can say that I'm in a situation where I also am a caregiver. So, on top of all of the other tasks that I have going on in my personal life, I mentioned I'm a PhD student, I'm also a therapist. I'm also caring for my mother who has dementia. This role has taken on its own life. And due to that, a lot of adjustments had to be made. Was I ready for it? Was I prepared for it? In a way, yes. But there was also a bit of, well, I don't think that's going to happen for a while. Interestingly enough, my mother, she was diagnosed with a mild cognitive impairment some time back. It was about 6 years ago. She received that diagnosis, and in that time, she knew that things were happening. Things were eventually going to progress, and she ended up having this hard conversation with me one day where she asked me, "Would you, when the time comes, help me out?" I, of course, not necessarily knowing what I would be expecting or putting myself into, said, yes, I love my mother. So I took on that role and I said yes by agreeing to sign a power of attorney and healthcare proxy for when the time would come that she would not be able to care for herself, to make financial decisions, to make healthcare decisions. And I would be that person to make those decisions on her behalf. There's a lot of weight that's put into that I did not realize. Now being in that position, this is coming full force, and I've become more aware of what it is to be a caregiver, something that I think many people do overlook. I certainly did. What it means. From my own perspective, it's amazing the kind of denial that comes along. From a personal standpoint, I can say that when I was in my adolescence, I took on a caregiver role as well for my mother, not to the same degree, not to the physical caregiving where I was helping her, with her daily tasks as I am now, but more so at an emotional capacity. So my mother did experience severe mental illness. And when she was having her episodes, I was the one who was there, who was caring for her emotionally. I was putting on that role of caring for her, where typically when it comes to parenting, it's the parent who is the emotional support for the child. This term is often referred to as parentification. And when parentification occurs, it's when you're parenting a parent. When I was an adolescent taking on this role as caregiving, taking that emotional responsibility for my mom, that was me making a shift. I didn't even realize it at that time, what was going on. It was just, well, I'm just caring for my mom. Also a bit financially as well. I was working my job at McDonald's, and through her own episodes was making some decisions that put us as a family, and she was a single mom, putting us as a family in some financial issues. When that occurred, then I had to essentially give her my paychecks that I was making at McDonald's as a 16-year-old. So all to say is that parentification is an aspect of parenting a parent. As caregivers, no matter where we are in our journey, if we are caring for our parent, there is that dynamic to think about. We are parenting a parent. Right now I'm in my 40s, and the dynamic shift, it's definitely become a moment of clarity for me, a moment of truth. In this new stage of caregiving, I was able to see that moment of realization when I was noticing that okay, she's really having a hard time making breakfast for herself. She has dementia. She's obviously starts forgetting things. And as things started to progress, she would just go into the kitchen and just stare at the refrigerator, or she would go into the cabinets and not remember what she was looking for, what she was doing. And so there did come a time where, I had to pick things up for her. All meals are being prepared either by myself or my wife, who I'm blessed to have help through the caregiver role. When we're talking about the emotional impact of what happened in that realization, it was, oh, okay, we're getting more into that. Things are happening now. And again, I think it was a bit of that denialism, because even before that, a moment of realization happened where I asked her to move in with me. And that was when she was living on her own and she was in a different state than I was. And at the time, she was doing things on her own, but she was finding more difficulty doing her everyday tasks that she would normally do. Most of it dealt with travel when it came to the difficulties that she had, such as like driving to church or driving to the CVS pharmacy to get her medications. The point where she was unable to get to church, even with the assistance of GPS, two GPSs actually. She had her Garmin that was a separate GPS, along with the one that's on her phone, both going at the same time, and she managed to get lost going to church, to the point where she froze and she became very scared. And in that moment of her panic, she knew that she would not be going to church after that, or she was too scared to, because she didn't want to get lost. But she's was limited, and that was seen in our conversations. And so I invited her to come live with me. And when she was living with me, things seemed to be fine. We had a routine that we were going through, and she was, for the most part, autonomous otherwise, outside of driving, a couple slips here and there, things that she would forget, but nothing that seemed too alarming. And it wasn't till this year, well, we're in 2025, so I guess it was early 2025. I guess it was in 2024, less than a year ago, when this alarm came. It was after an unfortunate event where she went into hypoglycemic shock. Her sugar level dropped to 14. The doctors at the hospital were completely in shock as to how she was not dead, how she was not in a coma, and how, frankly, she was fighting off nurses in her craze that she was in. That moment, she never returned home the same. When she was in this episode of hypoglycemic shock, she became completely disoriented. She didn't recognize who I was when we were in the ambulance. And she ended up going into the hospital and leaving the hospital with her sugar levels managed, but her mind impairment never returned to the same. She was then becoming more into her delusions. She was able to recognize me and the people in our home, our family, but she was not the same. It became so much more apparent. It's like she aged a decade after that episode. And it became an adjustment period for myself, for my family, as to, well, what's going to be the new. When she was at her new baseline, then we made some adjustments, and more responsibilities were taken over, such as being more on top of her schedule, even when it comes to her bathing, because she would forget to bathe. We noticed that she was forgetting to bathe. So we created a schedule then where I would get her up in the morning, she would go right into the shower, and she would bathe, which currently she's still doing autonomously. And after that, then breakfast is served. And that's part of the practical realities of parenting a parent. Adopting the responsibilities as you would a child. It's interesting because I also have children, and some of the things that now I do for my mother, I'm also doing for my kids. Different things like even waking her up on a schedule, just so we can go throughout our day and making sure that everyone is being taken care of as best as possible. That in itself can be a task, especially when you're caring for an elderly woman with dementia. So the realities of parenting a parent come with those daily responsibilities that then get changed. Also, another aspect is having some tough conversations. I recall having a conversation with my mom. She wasn't really washing herself adequately. And that takes me to the next topic of balancing respect and care. So after this conversation, it became important for me, that realization of, well, how are we going to balance being respectful to her as a human being and still caring for her? There are things that need to get done for her to, make sure that she's caring for herself, that she's clean, that she's hygienic, that she's still getting the best things for herself and for her well-being. But at the same time, you know, I'm her child. So there's that conflict that kind of comes into play, like in my mind. And so how do I navigate that? And there's always this kind of back and forth that goes on in those moments of, okay, I have to have this conversation, but I'm doing this out of love. I'm doing this out of care for her. Sometimes there's opposition. Sometimes there's that, well, why do I have to do this? Or sometimes she'll just say, like, I don't want to take a shower now. For me, as the caregiver, it can become frustrating. And sometimes that happens. And it's okay. When that happens, we become frustrated. Sometimes the best thing is to take a step back. I notice that I have to do that sometimes, where she's saying she doesn't want to take a shower or she doesn't want to eat. Like, okay, I'll come back. And I'll leave for a little while. And after a few minutes, typically she'll even be in a completely different mind state, and I'll come back and like nothing was ever said. Like, okay, are you ready to eat? If she continues on, then sometimes I'll leave to where maybe 10-15 minutes, she'll just come out herself and she'll say, what's for lunch? Or something along those lines, where she's in that routine already, and eventually she's just going to come out and do what she's used to doing. So all to say, it's important to practice patience while using empathy, and that can create the best case scenarios in most cases. Of course, we never know how things are going to go. I'm a caregiver for somebody with dementia. Some of you might be caregivers for people who have, or children who have an eating disorder, or somebody with special needs, or with a terminal illness. There's different things that we need to navigate when it comes to what we're caring for, the person that we're caring for, and what they are struggling with. But the biggest pull away from this is to try to be patient, and also with your patience, show empathy. There is most definitely an impact that caregiving can have on your personal life as a caregiver. It's going to impact your relationships. It's going to impact your work. It's going to impact things that you do on a daily basis. It certainly has for me. These are conversations that I've had to have with my wife, where we can't just go about our day and not include my mom, at least in our thought process. Just as, when we have children, when you're single and you have children, like, now you got to consider your kids. Same goes for when you have a caregiver, when you take on the caregiver role. Now, you can't just go on with plans that you might have normally done, or you might, but there should always be that consideration of what's going to happen with mom or whoever it is that you're caring for. So there are those life adjustments. Also, let's talk about work. Sometimes work roles are compromised. It's not easy to care for somebody. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy, physically, emotionally. If we have our own job, then it can take away from that time. If we have a physical location that we're going to, it might be difficult to have a 40-hour week. I've been blessed in that I have a job that my schedule can be flexible, and it does offer online options where I can provide therapy online. So it does help in the caregiver role. I can be home caring for my mother, caring for my responsibilities, but also not neglecting myself. That leads to another issue of, well, yourself as a caregiver. It's really important to care for yourself. Don't neglect yourself. As the saying goes, you can't pour from an empty cup, and that rings true. How do we care for ourselves? There are so many different ways. Everybody has different routines, but it's important not to neglect ourselves. I personally, I make sure that I exercise on occasion. I try to eat right. And when we are physically okay, then we will have more energy to go towards our physical or emotional or mental responsibilities that come with being a caregiver. It's also important to ask for help. Ask for help from family, friends, find professional support. What are things that you can do to find community support? Don't be an island in this. And I know that's one of the hardest things to do, in that we often feel that we're not understood. Our situations aren't understood as caregivers. One thing that I want to impress upon whoever's watching this video, if you are in a caregiver role, there are people around you who do understand. There are resources to tap into to help us in our own support, because as we support others, we also need to be supported as well, or feel supported. What can we do to help with that? One of my goals here in the Carers Corner is to provide some support, to provide some resources, to provide community. Ultimately, when it comes to being a caregiver and you're caring for a parent, then you're essentially parenting a parent, and that is not easy. What I hope you get from this is that you are being seen, that you are not alone. You are doing an incredible job, even if some days it doesn't feel like it. I get it. When's the first time that you felt a shift from being a child to being a caregiver? Let's support each other. Let us know in the comments below. When was that first time? I want to thank you for staying and watching this video. If you did enjoy what you watched and the content that was here, please feel free to subscribe and like this video. It really does help. I hope to bring out more videos to support us caregivers, to support this journey, so we're not in this alone.